About a year ago, Policy Horizons started kind of exploring the shifts in the life course, because the typical ways of ordering our lives and the sequence of life events is so much changing that as policymakers, we need to start paying attention to it and imagining how they might evolve going forward and what that means actually for the policy considerations we have to take into account. And so here today with us, we have Simon Robertson, who has been leading that work for Policy Horizons Canada, who will be giving you some of the findings and have a great conversation with some of our experts. If after this session you want to look more into the details of this work or of the Policy Horizons work overall, I invite you to visit our website. But also for the moment, know that there is a chat function on our virtual platform where you can communicate with the other participants of the conference, but also that's a place where we will be posting any links that are referred to by our speakers and also to our report. So Simon, à toi.
Thanks, Crystal. I'm excited to share our Foresight project about future lives. I have the pleasure of leading the team of analysts working on this project, who bring together expertise in neuroscience, education, political science, philosophy, economics, and the ethics of artificial intelligence. We are excited to share our work with you. What if it were common to give birth and raise young children much later in life? What if displacement due to a climate disaster no longer happened once in a lifetime, but rather on a frequent basis? What if it were customary to take extended periods of time outside of the workforce? Future Lives is an initial framework for exploring the changes in society that might be transforming how people in Canada live their lives. The changes in society that we're seeing today might shape people's life courses by influencing what they know, what they believe about the future, or what they value in life. As we reflect on changes to how people live, 6 areas of life stand out. They are care, education, living arrangements, reproduction, labor, and a period of older adulthood. Experiences in these 6 areas structure the life course for most people in Canada. Par exemple, nous entrons dans le monde en étant dépendants des soins de ceux qui nous entourent, et bon nombre d'entre nous le quitteront de la même manière. L'éducation nous permet de mieux comprendre le monde et d'y trouver notre place. Tout le monde a besoin d'un endroit où vivre. La création d'une nouvelle vie est un moment charnière du parcours de vie. C'est l'un des principaux moyens grâce auxquels nous établissons des liens entre notre vie et celle des autres. Pour la plupart d'entre nous, le travail est notre principale source de revenus. Et enfin, le 3e âge est une phase distincte de la vie, habituellement associée au fait de travailler moins et de donner et de recevoir plus de soins. These 6 areas all take a lot of people's time, financial resources, and effort. They often involve one or more key decision points, life events, or transitions. And importantly, these areas and decision points are organizing concepts for governments and society. They form the basis for policies that shape how people live their lives in the present and how they might live in the future. For all these reasons, significant changes within these 6 areas may be relevant for future policies and indeed future lives. So far, we have identified 9 sources of fundamental change. These 9 forces of change might be affecting the sequence and nature of the 6 life course areas in the following ways. Grâce au progrès de la science, de la médecine et des politiques sociales, de nombreuses personnes au Canada vivent plus longtemps et en meilleure santé. L'allongement de la durée de vie modifie le moment et la nature des événements de la vie. Les personnes qui vivent au Canada ont des enfants, achètent un logement et se marient plus tard qu'au cours des décennies précédentes, voire pas du tout. Actuellement, une personne sur 4, âgée de 65 à 69 ans, travaille encore. À l'avenir, comment la perspective de travailler à 70 ou 80 ans pourrait-elle affecter les choix de carrière plus tôt dans la vie? Comment une vie plus longue pourrait-elle toucher les personnes qui ont besoin de soins et celles qui les donnent? New reproductive technologies are making it more feasible for some individuals to delay giving birth until later in life. People are increasingly turning to surrogacy, egg or sperm donation, or frozen embryos from other people's IVF treatments. The choice to be childless is also increasingly destigmatized. In the future, what if the use of reproductive technologies is the norm? What if it is common to give birth and raise young children much later in life? Les normes sociales autour de la famille sont en train de changer. Par exemple, les normes qui entourent l'orientation sexuelle, le genre et les relations évoluent rapidement. De nouveaux types de relations, comme celles qui sont formées par choix et intentionnellement, estompent les distinctions traditionnelles entre amis et famille. À l'avenir, comment ces changements pourraient-ils motiver une demande de nouveaux types de logements? Comment ces reconfigurations familiales pourraient-elles créer une demande pour de nouvelles formes de soins? Data and AI-powered systems are increasingly used to make decisions about us and influence the decisions we make ourselves. For example, insurers use telematics to determine rates based on how we drive. Technologies that fit learning plans to student needs claim to improve learning efficiency 5 to 10-fold. In the future, how could AI influence the content and timing of education? Could AI be used to determine where people live and with whom? La façon dont nous accédons à la richesse et dont nous l'accumulons change. Jusqu'à présent, les salaires et l'épargne étaient le moyen le plus courant pour la plupart des gens de se constituer un patrimoine. Mais aujourd'hui, la précarisation de l'emploi et du logement contribue à une instabilité financière croissante pour beaucoup de gens. L'endettement des ménages atteint des niveaux records. À la fin de 2021, les ménages canadiens avaient une dette d'1,86 $ pour chaque dollar de revenu. Et si plus de gens décidaient de ne pas avoir d'enfants à cause de l'insécurité économique? Et si plus de gens pouvaient vivre de rente ou d'héritage plutôt que de travailler à plein temps? Rising existential anxiety is affecting people's health, socioeconomic security, and decisions about where and how to live. Many young families are giving up the dream of home ownership due to climate uncertainty and economic insecurity. 1 in 4 childless adults say concern about climate change is a factor in their decision not to have children. In the future, how could existential anxiety shape how young people prepare for older adulthood? How could existential anxiety change the kinds of care people need? En 2021, le Canada a accueilli le plus grand nombre d'immigrants en une seule année de son histoire. Les migrations internes ont aussi atteint des niveaux records. Mais les tendances futures dans ce domaine sont incertaines. les pays dont la population vieillit se font concurrence pour attirer des immigrants qualifiés. Il est difficile de prédire combien de temps les immigrants au Canada y resteront à l'avenir. Par exemple, 30% des jeunes néo-canadiens diplômés ont déclaré qu'ils déménageraient probablement dans un autre pays au cours des 2 prochaines années. À l'avenir, comment une émigration accrue pourrait-elle affecter les politiques de l'emploi? Comment l'immigration interne pourrait-elle affecter la disponibilité de logements? The structural forces that define how, where, and why we work over the life course are changing. People increasingly earn money in ways that do not fit neatly with current structures to regulate labor and income. Career changes have become more frequent. And with this, the expectation that people should reskill has become normalized. In the future, what new forms of education might emerge to address changing labor conditions? What new supports for reproduction and family leave might emerge from employers? Au Canada, les gens ont des croyances différentes quant à savoir si et comment le contrat social devrait changer. De plus en plus, les gens expérimentent des griefs socio-économiques remettant en cause la relation entre les gouvernements, les institutions et la population. Les institutions communautaires qui définissent les normes, comme les écoles, les lieux de travail, et les organisations religieuses, sont moins influentes qu'auparavant. À l'avenir, où l'instruction civique et sociale se fera-t-elle? Comment les attentes liées aux aidants naturels pour les personnes âgées pourraient-elles changer? Future Lives provides a framework for thinking about what transformative changes in society might mean for future lives and future policies. Now, I'd like to show you some videos that will explore changes in the areas of living arrangements, education, and older adulthood. After each video, we will turn things over to our panelists to react and discuss. Let's meet them. First is Faiz Abhuani. He is the founder of the nonprofit Brique par Brique, which provides innovative, affordable housing solutions in the gentrifying Montreal neighborhood of Parc Extension. Second is Suzanne Brant. She is president of the First Nations Technical Institute, which provides culturally informed education, emphasizing Indigenous ways of teaching and knowing. In her role and beyond, she provides leadership, vision, and innovation in Indigenous post-secondary education. And last, but certainly not least, is Jennifer Robson. Jennifer is an associate professor of political management at Carleton University. A former federal public servant, she focuses on Canadian social policy, tax and transfer policy, and household finances. Now, let's watch our first video on living arrangements. This video showed just some of the changes happening in terms of living arrangements. Some of these forces of change are identified in our Future Lives project. For example, some people in Canada are moving to a place where the cost of living is lower and where they can feel more financially secure. Some people are moving to escape the risks posed by climate change. Climate change and affordability could have impacts on long-established internal migration patterns. These forces of change could also shape how and where people build and design their homes. Or changes in the kinds of homes and support people need as they age in place and live longer could influence decisions about where to live. More frequent moving and these shifts in what people look for in a home could mean communities and neighborhoods look and feel different. Faiz, as people move more, what are some impacts on communities and the role community support plays across the life course?
Thanks for the question. I'll try to be brief. There are a lot of impacts that we observe on the ground here in the neighborhood of Park Extension in Montreal. But I'd like to just give a little bit of a background on this because what the impacts are a little bit of a factor of what the source of the impact is. And the source of the impact in our particular case is intersectional. It relates to a lot of the other challenges that you mentioned in your presentation. I guess one of the biggest factors that's leading to dislocation and a lot of turnover in the tenancy in our neighborhood is what we call the digital divide. So the neighborhood adjacent to our neighborhood is an AI hub as a result of a shift in the economy, but also as a result of provincial government investments in the AI sector, shifting from aerospace to the tech sector, and as a result of incentives like tax incentives from both the federal and the provincial government. And so this previously industrial sort of like cheap, forgotten area is now a high-tech hub, and a lot of people who come to work there are looking for housing, and so many of them will buy duplexes or incentivize the development of condos in our neighborhood, which reduces the density. And so it reduces density by impacting low-income diverse residents. Where these folks are going is not clear, but one thing's for sure is that the effect of the dislocation is that low-income diverse residents in our neighborhood who built support networks that made up for their lack of resources are going to places where they are more isolated. So they're not with members of their own communities, they're not with people that they can easily communicate with. And so they bear the brunt of I guess, of discrimination. There's another word for it. So they go to different neighborhoods where they're now different and where they don't know anybody. And so this has an impact, especially on the youth, but also on the elders who can no longer rely on people from their own communities to maintain their mental health. And this has an impact on their physical health. And a lot of the pressure, both from the youth and the elders, is felt by working age adults who feel more pressure to make more money so that they can move to places where there's more space and where there's less pressure from the environment that they're in. And so the pressure from the market is greater on that demographic. So the impact of that digital divide, which is actually caused by an increasing wealth in our society, increasing a wealth that's concentrated in the tech sector, has an impact on low-income people, especially diverse low-income people. And that's definitely has repercussions in society at large. And we saw that a lot with COVID. I'm not sure how much deeper I should go into that, but I think that I think that I'll leave it at that for now, and we can maybe elaborate later.
Thanks so much for that, Faiz. Suzanne or Jennifer, anything that that stood out there for you?
I think you know, having affordable housing in First Nations communities would be really an asset for you know, for a lot of our people, especially as you mentioned with COVID and the challenges with education. Yeah.
I guess one thing that jumped out at me watching it was thinking about how this might impact the focus for the federal role. You know, for a long time, the federal government has been primarily, you know, focused on the home ownership part of the housing market. You know, looking at its role as a market regulator for mortgages, providing ongoing tax preferential treatment for home ownership. You know, in the video, you noted that as many as 40% of renters are insecurely housed in terms of the proportion of their income that is going to pay for rent. And so I think if we see that continue, there's going to be pressure on the federal government to obviously accelerate some of the supply side solutions that it's been trying to, you know, talk about. But there's a real intergovernmental coordination issue here in terms of getting at restrictive zoning issues. And then also maybe a need to think about scaling up other kinds of policy instruments that have already been put on the books, like, for example, the housing benefit. That, you know, that might be something that there's more pressure to take a look at scaling that up compared to what we've been used to in terms of federal policy.
And Suzanne, how could access to affordable housing impact access to education in the longer run?
A lot of students that come into education have a, you know, leave with a heavy debt. And I think, you know, making that debt less by having more affordable housing during education and also after education is really, really important. And of course, that's going to improve, you know, quality of life and all of those benefits of having less debt.
And Jennifer, you touched a little bit on this as well, but do you see anything in terms of how changing household composition could affect some of those federal policies in the long run? And I see Suzanne too, so she may have some thoughts here.
Right. Yeah. So I mean, I briefly mentioned the issue of you know, local zoning rules that are not necessarily they may have been aligned for past assumptions around household composition, but as those are shifting, the zoning rules may need to shift as well. And the pressure or the desire for that policy change or awareness of the need for that change may be higher at the federal level, even though that's not necessarily where the responsibility lies. So that's what I meant in terms of an intergovernmental coordination challenge there.
And Faiz, you mentioned it a little bit as well in terms of the impact of some of these changes in terms of you know, living arrangements and affordability, but particularly with respect to you know, potentially immigrant or migrant communities. And given some of the recent trends that we discussed in the presentation, do you see how do you see that playing out in terms of some of the fairly large scale trends around immigration as well as internal migration?
Yeah, yes, an interesting question. When I watched the video, I was like, I felt like it was a bit of a sad video because everybody was like living alone and like looking out windows and stuff like that. I think that scene is, as sad as it is actually better than the reality that I'm seeing. Because what I'm seeing is, as a response to like lack of affordability and lack of access to information and that digital divide, that makes it so that even though there's more opportunities to find affordable housing, those opportunities are not evenly spread. So like low income yet educated people who are from the middle classes and are, third, fourth, fifth generation in Canadians. They have access to the best housing in our neighborhood, even if they have never lived here, even if they're just coming here to be students, because they're connected through networks online, and they swap out their apartments with each other. Whereas other people who might not speak French and English, especially if they don't speak French, they don't have access to that. So then the only opportunities for relocation are through Kijiji or Facebook Marketplace, which means that they're competing in the open market for rental housing. They also don't have access to information regarding social housing, which is all in French. And they don't have the social capital or the connections with do-gooders to get them in the lineups, which are, in any case, like waiting lists are years and years long. So, except for co-ops is more about who you know. So all this to say that it's really about it's even though the technology offers solutions, it offers solutions in a disparate way, such that if you don't have social capital, then you don't have access. The result, the impact that we see on the ground is that since people can't move, or because the costs are so high, or because the opportunities don't seem to be available, then a lot of folks, especially if they're first generation immigrants, especially if they're refugees, especially if they're non-status, will simply live more people in the same roof. And what happens then is for people, especially younger people, to feel free, to feel like they can express themselves, they end up spending more time online. And that time is not regulated, or there's no oversight from the parents because they don't really know how to use the technology. And you'll see a lot of young people now, they're constantly online, whether they be at home or at school or even in the parks. There's no really public spaces here. So what they're doing online is not clear, but whatever opportunities are offered by companies or institutions that are hungry for attention, that's where the energies are going. So whatever intervention we're going to make in terms of outreach, and the language that we use is going to have to be mediated through completely unregulated and rapacious online market.
Excellent. Thanks so much for that, Faiz. And I think you're touching on some of that interplay as we head forward in the future around technology and how that could potentially play a vital role here. So thanks so much for the great discussion on this. And now let's take it over and have a chance to watch our next video on education. in terms of education. And in a world where career changes are more common, people may be asked, expected, or feel forced to retrain more frequently and move towards a model of lifelong continuous learning. Online learning and AI and data-driven tools may become more central to how, where, and what people learn. These changes could have implications for traditional models and institutions of learning. More transient lifestyles might create demand for more flexible education. Radically new kinds of educational institutions may seek government recognition. The video also asks, if attendance at traditional learning institutions declines, where might the social and civic learning of the future take place? Suzanne, how might new forms of online learning create different futures for social and civic learning, or indigenous ways of learning, like land-based education?
Well, I think moving to a virtual sort of classroom setting was a big experience for our institute, for FNTI. We always had face-to-face, intense models of learning for Indigenous learners so that they can continue their responsibilities in community and education, family. Through the process of having to transition to a more digital-based, virtual classroom, we got to see how this could have major impacts in a positive way in our communities. And I think that it became better access for our learners. We were able to also still provide the healing and learning that needs to take place for Indigenous learners. We're trying to, change the experience of education. So through our institutes, we want to make sure that our students are supported in becoming, healthy, whole human beings. And we were able to still do that through a virtual learning environment. And we also can access new technologies for, say, virtual learning, where our students then can engage in Indigenous languages and be on the land in a virtual environment. And we're able to now connect easier communities to communities with Indigenous knowledge holders. Because of a loss of our culture and language and our traditional practice, the accessibility is not that, easily accessible. So now through the technology that exists, we're able to actually connect people and bring people together in a form that allows them to advance their learning. The other thing that's happening, as you've mentioned, is, and we got to see, is that there's a big shift in the skills and the development of those skills and when they're required and needed. And so we're able to now, our institute is now developing micro-credentials that actually can provide sort of those snapshots of educational need. And again, the accessibility is there into First Nations communities. And this has had huge impacts on our institute, in terms of our enrollment and growth and the potential that is there for, for access. And at the same time, still providing the cultural supports, the academic supports, and also our institute infrastructure in First Nations, as you know, is not always up to par. And so our institute was not able to come back together because of COVID. We don't have sufficient HVAC systems and things. So we've all transitioned to online work. And so being able to work from home, provide education from home, and connect into communities has been wonderful. It's really opened those doors to a lot of access.
And you touched on it a touch there, but could you briefly explain what land-based education means?
Okay, so we can bring people to the land. It's really allowing for access to a natural environment and teaching, because Indigenous culture is founded in relationships to elements in creation. We're able to actually bring people to those things, like even doing live feeds of plants and explanation of traditional uses of those plants, or practices like maybe skinning a moose. We can actually then see and be present even though we're not physically there through the technology. But land-based learning is really critical to expression of culture and tradition and practice. And we're able to make sure that even though we can't be physically together, we can still provide that information and access.
Excellent. That's great to hear. Thanks so much. Jennifer, if private models of post-secondary education and some of these new expectations around credentials come to rise, how do you see that affecting equitable access to education in the future? And the micro, Suzanne also mentioned micro credentials, I think in line somewhat with that.
Yeah, and like Suzanne, as somebody who works in a teaching environment, that whole transition to online has been wonderful in some respects, challenging in others, but that trend towards micro-credentialing, I think, is clearly here to stay. And likewise, some of that issue around reconciling in-person versus online and the use of technology and how that's all going to work. And yeah, there are big equity issues here. So one thing that comes to mind for me is actually a lot of our learning policy has focused on how do we recognize or how do we verify credentials of individuals, right? This has been an issue particularly for newcomers to Canada with credentialing, like micro-credentials, right? There's been a lot of focus on, do the aggregate of these lead up to a more traditional kind of degree? Does that matter anymore? There's going to be a lot of issues around navigation of the various kinds of learning opportunities for individual learners. But I think there's also this issue then of the credentialing of the training providers, because the traditional learning and education sector, like the PSE sector, has this fairly robust but slow, I would even say pedantic approach to credentialing new schools and programs and certifications. But we don't really yet have a good system other than the market, which of course, has its pros and cons, for quality control of training that's delivered outside that system. And I think we've already seen some inequities in the recognition of training that can be provided by private institutions. Sometimes they end up turning out to be fairly predatory private institutions who go after more vulnerable learners. The other thing that springs to mind for me is that if we're in a world of lifelong learning and models that we're moving away from sort of a period of your life where you learn up and then you join the workforce and you reap the reward on that learning, then we might need to start rethinking how we structure and distribute our supports for post-secondary learning. Right, we've kind of told ourselves that between loans and grants and tax measures, we've dealt with the main financial barriers to participation, and that the ones that are really left now are the non-financial, sort of attitudinal, educational ability, that kind of thing. But I think we're going to have to revisit that if the profitability motive becomes more important in the training sector. That is going to drive change in terms of the costs of learning and access to the existing tools that we have for student financial aid.
And Faiz, Jennifer touched on this a little bit just there about sort of the financial elements around grants and loans and such. But to you, if remote education continues to increase in the future, how do you think this could affect housing for students?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think that I've read a few articles about this with respect to how higher education institutions were dealing with enrollment constriction during COVID. And I think in the long-term trends I think that it's going to persist, kind of like the workplace, how the workplace is changing. So the direct impact of students on campus and the studentification factor in the gentrification in the central districts of our cities is probably going to abate. but it is not the only factor that contributes to gentrification. And I think that it's symptomatic. It's not like a source of inequality in and of itself. So that's one thing. The second thing is students are, if they don't have to be on campus, well, they may still want to be in the city. And there's a good chance that they will want to. If you survey students and you ask them what decisions drive their desire to study where they study, almost not, very little has to do with academics, and a lot has to do with social networks, access to like institutions, to like co-working spaces, to all the sort of like immaterial aspects of like class formation. So I don't think that that online learning is going to impact like how our cities are changing. But yeah, but however, I do think that there's a lot of opportunities in terms of in online learning. I recently discovered this really interesting person called Audrey Tang, and she's actually a minister in the Taiwanese parliament, and they're doing really interesting things with education in terms of like leveraging technology in order to offer educational opportunities that are centered around the interests of the students, and they're shifting the educational system from a competitive one to a collaborative one. So I think that there's a lot of interesting opportunities in education, but I think the biggest threat for sure is going to be the isolating aspect of online education. So again, the technologies have a lot of opportunities, but we're going to have to make sure that those opportunities are spread out evenly.
Excellent. Thanks so much. And thanks to all three of you for contributing on that. Now let's watch our final video on older adulthood. So that was fun. That video showed a very specific vision of older adulthood. The future depicted in this video may only apply to a small privileged group of people who have accumulated wealth and housing security earlier in the life course. However, our Future Lives project identifies several forces of change that may make the future increasingly uncertain, particularly when thinking about changing environmental, economic, and employment conditions, for example. The vision presented in this video may seem utopic, as not all older adults will have access to that kind of future. And many young people may not believe that this kind of future will ever be within their reach. This could have impacts on the kinds of choices people make earlier in their life course. Aging adults could look for different ways to achieve economic security. Home design and infrastructure development may evolve to be more accessible to more age groups. Jennifer, do you see potential tensions between the different experiences of older adulthood? And how do you think this might change how people prepare for their older adulthood?
That's a great question. And that was probably the most fun of the videos that we've seen so far today. So sure, there is a set of older Canadians, primarily from the baby boom generation, who are the skateboarding, gaming, gerontolescents, I think was the term used in the video. Yeah, they've got the money, whether through its retirement income, assets that they've accumulated, or they're continuing to work because they are in occupations that are favorable to that. And they've decided it's not too late to live their best life. And, good on them. That's great. But this is really a model or a vision of aging that assumes an enormous amount of luck earlier in the life course. It also, I think it's important to recall, those older adults will eventually become much older adults, right, of advanced age, who will need additional care, and who will, be facing the kinds of health challenges that they aren't necessarily yet in that video. So, is that a model that is that an image or an aspirational vision of aging that is going to change how people plan? Maybe it will for those who have a lot of agency about their occupational choice during working life, and a lot of agency over their personal financial decisions. But there is, as you said, Simon, a lot of heterogeneity amongst older adults. So I do worry a little bit about policy that might be built by and for a fairly small group of high income, highly educated seniors who are still very attached to the workforce, which is something it's just easier to do, and it's certainly a lot more common in the public service and in academic jobs like mine. And that could do an awful lot of harm for older adults who have lower incomes or who have serious health or housing challenges. So you mentioned this issue of the changing imperatives that would permit aging in place. To come back to our conversation earlier on housing, if we need to be thinking about expanding tools not just for home ownership, but also thinking about renters, that's going to be a major shift, right? There are not too many affordable renting options that are really built to serve older adults. The other issue, I think, is of course about the financial planning and preparation. There is a possibility in an environment of constrained labor supply that, yes, this is a positive development to see more older adults staying attached to the workforce. It's probably not enough to actually close the labor supply gap, and that might put pressure on employers to start expanding non-wage benefits, including things like retirement security through pensions. But I think we're still going to need those public backstops, good, robust public backstops on retirement income, and also to be thinking about public services and public infrastructure that will make communities livable places for the wide population of older adults. Because otherwise we risk going back to an environment where we've got major polarization in quality of life amongst Canadian seniors, which is, that was the reality in Canada that prompted us to start creating some of these big national programs like OAS in the first place.
Thanks for that, Jennifer. And Faiz, I was going to ask you about this as well, but in this sense, Jennifer touched a little bit on sort of that housing dynamic at play with respect to owning and renting as well. But this project's looking at the entirety of the life course. So how do you, as people are living longer and many want to do that aging in place, what long-term impacts could this have for people who are hoping to buy their first home?
Yeah, for this question, I have to say this is probably the question I find the most nebulous, Maybe because I haven't thought about aging as much, but I'll very quickly say two things. One, for sure, affordability is an issue right now. I'm a real estate agent, and I work a lot with like people who are first-time buyers, and more younger people are getting priced out. And those who are not getting priced out are people who are getting support from their parents, which means that there's a certain class of people whose parents are getting indebted again. What that means for the lifestyle of their parents and the sacrifices that they're making for their kids, that's something that I haven't really explored, but I think it's worth exploring. We're going through the largest transfer of wealth in human history between the boomers and the millennials. So what impact that has on boomers in terms of where they're taking their lives. I see a lot of sellers who are downsizing, a lot of sellers who are traveling. So there's a class of elders who are much more mobile and who are living seem to be living a kind of like a second wind or something. And in terms of the lower income folks, I see a lot of isolation, especially with COVID. I see a lot of mental health issues. I see a lot of, especially with the bridge between the second and the first and the second generation. I see a lot of elders who feel lonely and who don't have the ability to connect with their children as much, and who are experiencing a lot of dependence on those kids. And those kids are feeling a lot of pressure to take care of their parents, but to do so with financial resources that they may or may not have. So that's yeah. But I'm sorry, I can't really speak much to this.
No, I think you're right into some of the core things that we've outlined here, and you talked a bit about some of the key elements, touched on in the video around people who might be taking on that gerontolescence way of living, and through things such as travel and such. Suzanne, you touched a little bit this in terms of education and potentially some multi-generational aspects there, but what possible futures could you see for current models of education as people do live longer and extend their working lives?
I think the knowledge transfer is at its peak right now. When you can bring in multi-generations of experience into a classroom and transfer education, provide education in a way that transfers that knowledge, I think it's a great opportunity. Also because of micro-credentialing and intense professional modes of delivery, having the virtual environment, there's more intense access to that knowledge. We can change our education system so you're not in class for a couple hours here and there kind of thing as the model is today, but make it more intense and give those elders an opportunity to transfer their knowledge to the next generation in a very meaningful way, but also in a way that allows for the older generation to still have the freedom to do the things that they want to do, but they can feel valued and contributing and continue that contribution through the education system. I think it's a wonderful opportunity to connect generations. And we're seeing that within our institute. We're seeing multi-generations now coming back to school and having two generations actually attending classes. And so there's lots of opportunity, I think, in this environment that we're in.
So that two generations attending at the same time seems to be picking up on some of that around sort of energy and desire among some people in older age groups to potentially do more things. Is that what you're hearing from the people who are taking that on?
Yeah, and when you look at the areas of research, a lot of the young people need that mentorship. They need to have that experience. And so, yes, definitely, and especially in Indigenous knowledge, there was a gap in our knowledge transfer because of residential schools and the impacts of the policies that have been in place. So we're seeing that ability to bring them into the classrooms together and to share and to transfer and to to experience land-based education in the fullest. And again, giving value to our elders, bringing that back to to the older generation, but that transfer into a multi-generational process. And I think that's on all levels of skill development, not just Indigenous knowledge, but on any skill, that there's an opportunity there.
That's great. Thank you so much. And what a great conversation we've been having. I certainly feel like these forces of change have many more implications for the life course that may be important for policy leaders to explore. So thank you so much, Faiz, Suzanne, and Jennifer, for your wonderful contributions, insight, and time here today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you very much, all of you. It was really wonderful to hear you talk. And like in the chat, for example, people were talking about how difficult it is actually to create policy in one of the domains because it has such an impact on the next domain. But it's actually that kind of a framework, the way of thinking about these 6 elements and the 9 kind of influencers of that hopefully is going to provide some level of framework to start thinking about that. It's kind of by changing one of those elements, you kind of lock in potentially a future in the other element. So we hope people will kind of take it up like that. And you have really been showing today here also on how that kind of works. And I've shown some of those connections. So I'm very grateful for that. Thank you very much. Miigwech, merci à vous d'être ici avec nous aujourd'hui.
To learn more about Foresight and read our latest reports, please visit horizons.gc.ca.